Good morning, everyone. I'd like to call the BESE retreat to order. Roll call, please.
Dr. Bofi?
Present.
Mr. Castillo?
Here.
Dr. Davis?
Here.
Ms. Ellis?
Here.
Mr. Garvey?
Here.
Ms. Holloway? Here. Mr. Mellering?
Here.
Mr. Morris?
Here.
Ms. Orange-Jones? Not in attendance, Mr. Rock? Not in attendance, Ms. Fauché?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Thank you. Next item.
Your first item is on page 1, consideration of an update report regarding the Social Studies Content Standards Review Process, Committee, and Work Groups.
One moment, please. I'm sorry. One more choose the directions.
If you have
Okay. Good. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. We're so happy to see you this morning on our BESE retreat. It's sort of informal, but yet we still have to follow certain procedures. And this morning, I do want to acknowledge that we have special guests with us. And out of the audience, we have Representative Chuck Owens. All right, please stand for the great work that you do. Thank you. Appreciate it. Anyone else have we missed in the audience that's from the legislature? Today, our retreat will run a little different. As you see here at our dais is our BESE members and other guests with us from the legislature. And what we have in store here is that there's a partnership with our House Ed representatives and our Senate Ed senators. And with us today, we do see here Senator Kirk Talbot and your district,
District 10.
10, and you will hear from him, today. But I see Representative Mark Wright from House Head has arrived, and there's traffic delays out there. So, Mark, can you state your district, please?
Yeah, sure. District 77.
Great, thank you. We're quite pleased to have these individuals with us as we work through our social studies standards review process. And you will note that we will go through the delivery of the framework with Dr. Bromley and his staff. And then we will have the questions and answers and also an overview of the inquiry-based approach, the timeline, the status of the framework, and the next steps. We'll also talk about curriculum adoption process, so individuals can understand the difference between standards and curriculum, and the department is charged to do that. And we know that they will deliver great information to us today. And so this is the opportunity for senators and representatives from the Education Division in the legislature to work with us and as we move forward with the Department of Ed. Dr. Bromley?
Thank you, President Holloway, members of the board. I do share appreciation for members of our legislature being here with us today. But beyond that, just the continued work and engagement throughout the last year and where we have to go in the future. So thank you to everyone. Since our last retreat, we have made a few additions to our staff as the year has progressed, and I just wanted to take a moment and just recognize some of those individuals so that members, you'll have a name and a face that can match, and so you'll know who we're referring to, or whenever you get an email from someone who is in that role. So I'll start in our, and you know, this is from our last retreat, last August, some of our shifts. I'll start in our Office of Assessments, Accountability, and Analytics. Our assistant superintendent in that office, and everyone just stand and wave when I call your name, Mr. Thomas Lambert. Our Director of Accountability, Policy, and Analytics, Dr. Stephen Zappery. Moving into Equity, Inclusion, Opportunities Office, we have a new Executive Director of Diverse Learners, Ms. Meredith Jordan. We have a Deputy Assistant Superintendent for Charter Accountability, Dr. Danlin Hippolyte. We have an Executive Director of Portfolio, Ms. Christine Barker. Moving to our Teaching and Learning Office, Deputy Assistant Superintendent for Educator Development, Jim Cooper. Deputy Assistant Superintendent for School Improvement, Ms. Malika Morgan. Deputy Assistant Superintendent Early Childhood, Ms. Karen Powell. Director of Assessment Content, Ms. Melissa Kilpatrick. In our College and Career Readiness Office, Child Welfare and Attendance Liaison, Ms. Shanika Adams. In our Operations Department, Director of Communications, Matthew Johnson. Our Executive Director of Board Development and Human Resource, our Human Resource Director, Dr. Dawn Love. And finally, in the Policy and Governmental Affairs Office, Director of Governmental Affairs, Mr. Ethan Lawson. Thank you, President Holloway.
Good. Welcome aboard, and we're looking forward to working with all of you. Thank you.
Yeah, at this time, we'll go ahead and work our way into a presentation
Before we do
regarding...
that, can we get a motion to receive?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry about that. Motion to receive, please, Ms. Ellis, and seconded by Mr. Castillo. Thank you. I'm sorry.
No problem. At this point, we'll go ahead and work our way into the presentation around Louisiana Social Studies Standards Review. There's really no need for me to make introductory remarks, as the remarks that I would make are embedded into the deck. So at this time, I'll ask Dr. Jenna Chesson, Assistant Superintendent for Teaching and Learning, to make the presentation. Thank you, President Howell.
Good morning. I'm happy to have the opportunity to present to you today an update on the Louisiana Social Studies Standards Review process. We have had educators, can you hear me?
It's almost like get close. Really close.
We have had educators hard at work over the last several months on our Social Studies Standards Review process, so I'm happy to be able to present to you all today an update on where we are in the process today. Firstly, you may be wondering why now? And so we'll begin to look back through some of the rationale of why we are reviewing our social studies standards at this point in time. Just a reminder, the Social Studies Standards Review Committee is charged with reviewing and revising the standards, not curriculum. While they are definitely related, standards and curriculum are not the same thing. Standards are what students should know and be able to do. It is the end result. Standards represent a goal or an outcome of an educational program. They are vertically aligned, expected outcomes for all students. They establish a statewide baseline of what students should know and be able to do at the conclusion of a grade or grade span, but they do not dictate the lesson plan or how units should be organized. Curriculum, on the other hand, is a delivery system for ensuring that all students achieve the desired goal. Curriculum is the planned interaction of students with instructional content, material, resources, and processes. And just a reminder that here in Louisiana, all school systems are able to purchase instructional materials that are best for their local communities. And this is done intentionally, since those closest to students are best positioned to decide which instructional materials are appropriate for their school system and classrooms. The Louisiana Student Standards for Social Studies were last revised in 2010-2011. BESE Bulletin 741 states that the Louisiana content standards shall be subject to review and revision to maintain rigor and high expectations for teaching and learning. Such review to each content area shall occur once every 7 years. So as you all can see, this process was a few years overdue. By rigor, this word within the policy is referring to instruction, schoolwork, and the educational expectations that are academically and intellectually challenging for students. Since their implementation back in 2010-2011, we've heard a lot of feedback from educators who implement these standards on the sequence and organization of the content in the current social studies standards. You can see here a quick rundown of the current content sequence and course progression for social studies. The American Revolution is taught in 4th grade, but the French and Indian War isn't taught until the end of the following year in grade 5. The grade 6 course covers 95% of human history from the earliest humans, after which students jump back to study the American Revolution once again in grade 7. 7th grade ends with Reconstruction, but the effects of and the rise of Jim Crow are curiously absent from the high school U.S. history course. This lack of cohesion does not help students form solid chronologies which they need to make valid causal connections. In addition to the sequence of content that I just overviewed, we have also received a lot of feedback from educators in the field about the standards themselves. Not all of the feedback and comments has been negative about our standards, as they do have positive points. But here are a few of the key issues that we also hear. We hear that content is unnecessarily repeated in multiple grades. We hear that some essential, highly complex content is taught at the elementary level and never again. We also hear frequently that some content is not accessible for the grade level. For example, we know that primary source documents are so important for students to engage with on a regular and ongoing basis. But in 3rd and 4th grade, students are learning Louisiana history and American history, and it's often difficult for them to read on the grade level of those primary source documents. More recently, the Fordham Institute, an American nonprofit education policy think tank, released a review of all the state's civics and history standards. This report used letter grades to score standards on their U.S. history and civic standards. In our case, they reviewed both our standards and our Louisiana companion documents for social studies. In civics, we received a C and a B+ in U.S. history. The report also identifies some specific weaknesses in our current standards. No specific civic skills are defined and called out. They have organizational and sequencing flaws that need attention, similar to what I just overviewed with the current course content. Despite much comparing, describing, and explaining in grades K-8, there is no expectation that students master more sophisticated skills in social studies, like distinguishing between fact and opinion, or being able to detect bias. Some of the content covered in the elementary level is too advanced, and sometimes it is not revisited in middle or high school. The Fordham report also included some key recommendations for our standards revisions. The new draft addresses all of these recommendations. They include ensure that federalism and the 14th Amendment are covered in high school, add civics-related skills to the standards, shift some of the impressive U.S. history content from the K-8 level to a full high school survey, and provide a more basic U.S. history introduction in earlier grades. Also to clarify the status of the companion documents in the main standard documents. This report from Fordham was released at the end of June, but the BESE standards review process actually dates back to this past December when I first presented to you all on the launch of the process. And so in December, BESE voted to review the Louisiana Student Standards for Social Studies, and LDOE opened applications to participate in the Standards Review Committee to Louisiana teachers, school system staff, administrators, parents, students, and community members. BESE also approved some specific goals that are on this slide. The first of which is to shift to an inquiry-based approach with a balanced focus between acquisition of knowledge and disciplinary skills. Create a more coherent sequence of content so students are better able to build and retain knowledge over time. Strengthen instruction at the elementary level to ensure students are prepared for secondary and post-secondary coursework. Better integrate the historical perspectives of people from all different backgrounds. And provide students with opportunities to utilize strong critical thinking skills to evaluate and synthesize information. Next, we'll take a deeper dive into the timeline, application, committee selection, and the overall standards review process so far. Hopefully Hopefully the reasons for and the goals of the standards review are clear. We have stuck to 2 guiding principles to try and help us achieve those goals. The review process guiding principles are, firstly, diversity of perspective. As closely as possible, committee membership reflects the geographic and demographic diversity of the state's student population. Public input. The review process also includes opportunities for the public to weigh in on every standard, which I'll talk about a little later in the presentation. In addition to this, all committee meetings will be open to the public. Let's take a look at the timeline to date. Back in December, BESE voted to review Louisiana Student Standards for Social Studies, which kicked off the process. On December 18th, LDOE released an application to serve on the committee. From February 1st to March 5th, 8 LDOE staff members reviewed 328 applications using a rubric aligned to the BESE priorities. On March 9th, BESE approved the Social Studies Content Standards Review Committee and Workgroup membership. On March 27th, we held our first steering committee meeting. And from March 29th to the present, the content workgroup members have been working on the standards. On April 1st, the first steering committee deck and video were posted on our website in the Standards Committee Review Library. From March 28th through June 17th, the content workgroup developed an initial draft of inquiry and content standards. From May 24th through June 11th, we held our Teacher Leader Summit, both in person and virtually, and we included some update sessions to let Louisiana educators know about the standards review process. On June 18th, a draft revised standards were posted in our Standards Committee Review Library. And on June 26th, we held our second steering committee meeting. On June 27th, the second steering committee meeting deck and video posted in the Standards Committee Review Library. The committee meetings in March and June were both held on Saturday in order to be more accessible to those in the public who wanted to either come in person or watch the live stream event. On July 15th, the steering committee was notified of the rescheduled July 31st meeting. In order to promote the application, the call for applications went out on December 18th via a post on our website, along with posts on Facebook and Twitter in an effort to inform the public and solicit as many applications as possible. The application was highlighted again in the January Teacher Leader newsletter. The application period was 45 days. To complete the application, applicants filled out one of 2 forms. Parents, guardians, students, and community members filled out one form, and another form was specifically for educators and those with relevant educational experience in history, law, geography, or economics. To score the applicants, we wanted to use as objective a process as possible. 8 people from 4 teams within the department reviewed the applications using a rubric that reflected the goals outlined by BESE for the review. Each application, after having identifying information removed, received multiple reviews. The scores were averaged and ranked from lowest to highest. The ranked applications were separated by geographical region to ensure that the committee would be comprised of teachers and stakeholders from all parts of Louisiana. Here's how the review committees are structured. The larger 28-member steering committee includes 2 non-voting BESE members as liaisons to the process. This steering committee is driving the process and will make the final recommendation on revision to the standards to BESE. The content work groups, which are composed primarily of teachers with specific content expertise, are actually writing the revised standards for the steering committee to discuss and vote on. The content work group reviews public comment after each steering committee meeting and is represented on the steering committee by several members from each work group. So we have a few folks who sit on both the work group and the steering committee as liaisons between those groups. The LDOE has facilitated the process by presenting BESE's goals to the steering committee and work groups, by providing some resources to frame the process to the work groups, and by providing technical support upon request. Each of the work groups was responsible for certain grade levels and courses, but there was a lot of overlap to help with vertical progression and general alignment and cohesion of standards. I'd like next to share an overview of the resources that LDOE provided to the content work groups to help support them in their work of drafting the standards. First, we provided access to the current 2011 Louisiana Social Studies standards. After the draft standards were discussed at the second committee meeting, the LDOE created a crosswalk between the 2011 standards and the new draft to help work group members. The crosswalk was used to make sure that work group members could see differences in the versions and to ensure that content-required legislation was addressed in the draft, like founding principles of the United States of America. We also provided the advanced placement course descriptions for U.S. history, government and politics, human geography, and world history, as advanced placement course descriptions and syllabi have long been recognized as a standard for rigor in teaching social studies. We also provided work group members with easy access to all 50 states' social studies standards. The social studies standards vary, of course, from state to state. We also provided a document that outlined standardized and inclusive language to use. This guide was reviewed by our LDOE Office of Equity, Inclusion, and Opportunities before going to work group members. Finally, we provided committee members with generalized guidance when it comes to how to write good content standards with things like measurability and coherence. Next, we provided the C3 framework, which was written in 2014. This document aims to support states in creating standards that prepare young people for effective and successful participation in college, careers, and civic life. It provides guidance to states on upgrading state social studies standards to include the application of knowledge within the disciplines of civics, economics, geography, and history as students develop questions and plan inquiries, evaluate and use evidence, and communicate conclusions. The College, Career, and Civic Life Framework for Social Studies Standards was created as a product of a collaboration among 15 professional organizations committed to the advancement of social studies education. These 15 professional organizations include groups like the American Bar Association, the American Historical Association, the National Geographic Society, and these groups all came together to create this document that was then published by the National Council of Social Studies. Finally, the department also introduced steering committee and work group members to the Educating for American Democracy roadmap, a bipartisan effort to create an inquiry framework not dissimilar to the C3 framework published in 2014. The two documents are meant to work side by side, and this is for states to use when crafting history and civics standards and curriculum. But it is in itself just a framework or roadmap and not standards or curriculum. The first goal outlined by BESE for the review is to shift to an inquiry-based approach with a balanced focus between acquisition of knowledge and disciplinary skills. The steering committee endorsed this through a vote at their March meeting, and the content work groups have attempted to draft standards that reflect that shift. Some of the public comments at our last committee meeting expressed some concern about inquiry and some confusion as to what is meant by an inquiry-based approach. So I wanted to cover what is meant by an inquiry-based approach in today's presentation. So what is inquiry-based instruction? Inquiry, according to its definition, is a request for information and examination of facts. Through inquiry-based instruction, students learn foundational content and are encouraged then to explore the material, ask questions, make connections, and generate and defend claims. Inquiry emphasizes expressing understanding through writing and speaking and builds on the natural curiosity of students and increases engagement by making learning meaningful. Louisiana teachers have been using an inquiry-based approach in their classroom for years. Many teachers already use instructional materials that incorporate inquiry, though they are far from a complete curriculum. The DBQ project, Stanford History Education Group, and the OER project are all examples of this. The department has also offered professional development sessions related to inquiry-based instruction at multiple teacher leader summits dating back to at least 2016. As a matter of fact, inquiry and its components were part of the department's 1987 Louisiana Social Studies Fair and World History Guides. Here we can find language not dissimilar to the evaluating sources and developing claims portions of our draft inquiry standards. In 1987, the language used is to apply divergent thinking in formulating hypotheses and generalizations capable of being tested. And the current draft standards say to construct and refine claims and counterclaims with clear reasoning and evaluate the strengths and limitations of the claims and counterclaims. The draft standards try to systematically build these skills from kindergarten through 12th grade. In a classroom that takes an inquiry-based approach, these are some of the things that we can expect to see and hear from both students and teachers. Students are still expected to learn factual, fundamental content via direct instruction. Students respond to and craft legitimate questions about social studies content. Students develop claims about social studies topics through engagement with primary sources and scholarly interpretations of them, such as the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights. Students deliberate and debate claims and counterclaims with their peers, then express valid claims in a variety of ways. Teachers would be seen providing background information and context to any investigation through targeted lectures, videos, and concise scholarly journals. Teachers would provide frames for investigations and guides and assist in generating compelling and supporting questions. Teachers would also be seen supporting the development of historically valid claims, challenges students with engaging counterclaims, and points out evidentiary weakness or illogical argumentation. The draft standards currently include inquiry standards as well as content standards. In March, the steering committee also voted to revise the current content sequence to a new content sequence. And you heard me earlier voice over the current content sequence and some of the flaws and the lack of cohesion and flow from one grade level to the next. This is a look at the revised content sequence as it stands now in the 2021 draft social studies standards. It addresses the issues we discussed earlier. The high school course does circle back to some of the events of the early 20th century in more detail. And the content work groups found this to be a more coherent sequence of content by which students could build their knowledge and understanding. I also wanted to make sure to update you all today on some revisions to the timeline that you all initially saw and approved back last December. At the June 26th steering committee meeting, the committee received much public comment. Therefore, on July 16th, Dr. Brumley rescheduled the third steering committee meeting, which was supposed to occur on July 31st. It was rescheduled to September 25th. In order to give the content work groups more time to review public comments and make further revisions to the draft standards. This change will allow the work group members the time they need to effectively incorporate feedback into the standards. I believe adopting the correct set of standards is vastly more important than meeting a predetermined timeline. Let's be clear, our kids deserve better, more rigorous standards. And that's a quote from the email that Dr. Brumley sent to the steering committee members notifying them of the new date. This timeline reflects the rescheduled steering committee date as well as updates to the public comment period, presentation for BESE approval, and implementation and assessment schedule. On September 25th, we plan to hold the next steering committee meeting. At this meeting, there will be a vote to endorse the revised standards. During the month of October, we will hold a 30-day public comment period on the revised proposed standards. During this time, we invite public comment through the submission online during the entire month for each and every individual standard. In December, the plan is to bring the revised standards and public comment presented to BESE. During the 2022-2023 school year, LPOE will provide resources and educator professional development that will kick off at next May's Teacher Leaders Summit. In spring of 2023, the LEAP 2025 Social Studies Assessment for 3rd through 8th grade would have its final administration. And during the 2023-2024 school year, the revised standards for social studies would be implemented in school systems. The 23-24 year would also see new social studies assessments for grades 3 through 8 in high school civics during a field testing administration. And during the 2024-2025 school year, the new social studies assessments would become fully operational. This builds in an additional learning year from the previous timeline. And this is just to give educators across the state more time to learn the standards in order to best implement them. We hope to present the revised 2021 social studies standards to BESE in December. All parts of this timeline are, of course, pending the approval of the 2021 social studies standards. And I'm happy to take any questions that you all may have.
Okay. Initial questions, Dr. Bofi, your hand is up.
Yes. I have a question about how the public comment period will work. I know in the past we've posted standards online, so they were easy for people to access them, and then they were able, or access them, and then they were able to provide comments on specific standards. Is that something that you intend to do this go round?
Yes, the process will be very similar to the past. We'll have every individual standard posted and an opportunity for folks to comment on each standard. The plan is to do that during the entire month of October for a 30-day period.
Okay. And then can we go back to the order of like the proposed order of teaching?
Yes, Dr. Bo, if you don't mind, I want to read this statement. I've been told that you have technical difficulties on your end, or you can.
Right, we can't see the screen.
Can't see the screen. We have not received hard copies of this presentation, so I just made a request that we could have a hard copy before us, so this could help us with our questions moving forward. And the department, Betsy's working with the department to get this at hand for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So on this slide, I just wanted to spend a little time on it. I guess a concern for me is when I was learning how to be a social studies teacher, something that was pointed out to me was the need to start closest to the child so that they can develop an understanding. So world history for a 3rd grader is a foreign concept, right? And so I am interested in whether or not this has been done in other places to start with world history at such a young age. Because I just wonder, I mean, so a 3rd grader is probably about 8 years old, is that right?
Yes.
And so do they, and going so far back in time, I do have some questions about how effective that is. I mean, I get the need for a change, right? Because there's content that we want to cover once kids get a little older. But I do wonder how an 8-year-old or 9-year-old can go back 70,000 years to parts of the world that they haven't seen or even heard of before.
Okay, thank you. If I may, I'd like to welcome Representative Ted James. Thank you for being here. He represents District 101, the House of Representatives. Thank you. I also want to state this, that Senator Cleo Fields was supposed to be here due to a funeral. He's not able to make it, and that's why we have Senator Kirk Talbot. But we do send sympathies and prayers to his family. Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Miller.
Thank you. Dr. Brummer, this may go to you. I'm not sure. Just whoever is the best to kind of answer this. We talked a little bit about the selection process of the committee members. Can you just explain a little bit more for everybody how that was done, what was considered, what factors went into it, so we can have a little bit more understanding?
Yeah, absolutely. So the process, we opened the applications that I talked about earlier. We received 328 applications. When we went to actually score the applications, we removed identifiable information so that we were scoring based on the answers to the questions. So for example, for the educators, we were looking for folks with the most experience, the most education, the most background in social studies. We also asked them some questions around the guiding principles that were approved by BESE last December, their openness to revised standards. And so we then scored based on rubrics that were aligned to those things that I just mentioned, and then we ranked. Once they were ranked, we put back on the identifiable information. So then we were then able to plug into spots, because the steering committee is made up of parents, it's made up of community members, of students. And so we were able to plug into spots, still valuing the highest scores, but also paying attention to the geographical and demographic makeup of our state that best mirrored our student population.
Who was it that made the final decision?
So it was, we had members from LDOE, from across teams.
And then the board approved those.
And the board approved them as
Yes.
well.
Yeah,
So-
ultimately came to us.
Yeah, every application was scored by multiple people, blind scored by multiple people, and then they were averaged together.
Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Morris.
Yeah, could you go back to the slide on the timeline? No, I was wondering if there's any contingency in there for any potential recycle, whenever after the BESE review.
A potential, I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
So it's going to come to BESE in December, right?
Yes.
BESE's going to review the recommendation. BESE has any comments at that time that will generate some recycle or further review, if that were the case? Is there any contingency built into the timeline for that to occur?
So that's completely up to BESE, whether you all choose to endorse it or not at that December meeting. That's the current plan, is that we would present to you all draft standards proposed to be approved at that December meeting. If that does not happen, it would really depend on how long it would take after that further review. It would depend when that would come in the January meeting, in the March meeting. We do have some extra time built into this timeline because we did already extend. As we made that October to December shift, we built in this learning year. We think it's just really crucial to give educators the time that they need to learn the new standards in order to best implement them. So we did already build in a learning year just with the extension from October to December. So we do have some time. If BESE would delay a few months longer than that, we would have to review this timeline.
Thank you.
And Mr. Morris, it will also go into a bulletin, which will allow for another term of public comments. Unless it's an emergency rule, it'll take about 4 months to come into final effect from the point that BESE approves it, if there are no public comments.
Any other questions? Yes, Dr. Davis.
How does this work, the timeline work regarding curriculum? And so finding textbooks or resources that match the new standards and then getting them in the hands of districts? Because it looks like if things go according to plan and we approve it in December, that's a year and a half. Is that typically, I guess we all already be identifying curriculum so that we can make sure districts can have their spread of choices and adopt their curriculum in time?
Yes, so that is built into this timeline, that during the learning year, we would be engaging in an instructional materials review process, a cycle of reviewing materials to then deem as high quality in order for school systems to make their selection of curriculum.
Mr. Mallon?
Just a few more. Piggybacking off of what Dr. Brooks said, we go back to that new proposed timeline. Yeah, very good. I believe you and I talked about it, maybe Dr. Bowman. There have been teachers that have expressed concerns to me about the shift in the middle school, and is there a contingency plan for the transitional year or something like that at this point where, since we are shifting how U.S. history is taught, there's a potential gap where someone would miss out on a year of section of American history? Has that been contemplated or planned for that to be addressed?
Yes, absolutely, that's a really great point. So we've also had this before, we've experienced this before when we've made shifts in standards. There would be gaps for students, and so that's been the department's role, along with the teacher leader advisors that we work with across the state, to create documents and resources to fill any gaps that students could have. Again, that's why that learning year is so important. It will give us, engaging with teacher leaders across the state, time to make those resources and then provide professional development to teachers and how to implement them. There will be some bridge years where we are making sure that students don't have gaps because we are moving from one content sequence to another.
And then kind of hitting on this too, like Dr. Bowman said, this is a seismic shift, it looks like, in how they're doing this. You mentioned earlier the Fordham study gave us a B+, which, I mean, to be honest, that's pretty good for us. What thought, if anything, went into why are we shifting this much where it seems as if, like you referenced based on the Fordham study, some minor tweaks or improvements were needed as opposed to maybe a total overhaul?
So I will say the Fordham study specifically looked at civics and U.S. history standards. It made some remarks in the report about U.S. history, but it was specifically those grades, so that C and that B+ were specifically for our civics and our U.S. history standards. They also reviewed some of what we call our companion documents that sit alongside our standards that have been created over the years to help educators interpret the standards and implement the standards. And that Fordham report really told us that it was those two working together that actually gave us the scores that we have from that report. And so I will say that this is a current content sequence as based on the selection of the content work group and how those educators with their experience in social studies expertise felt like a student's understanding and knowledge of social studies content would best progress from year to year.
What was the baseline? When the content and the work groups came in, were they given a set of proposal that the department came up with, or were they given the current standards and said, here's current standards, go? Or was there already a draft of a proposed set of standards given?
So they were given the current standards. They were also provided with all of the different state standards. And then our team at LDOE really served as technical support for the content work groups to have those conversations and work out where this would all best fall.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We will have public comments, and we will also come back after public comment to continue with questions.
I do have a comment. I mean, as I was teaching, the thematic approach was really popular, and I think that's what Ms. Bogey's discussing. Was that anywhere in the research that you guys are looking at for this alignment of standards? Taking more of a thematic versus chronological. So like what's happening, what's happening closest to kids versus, starting 70,000 years ago. It does seem odd to me. I have not done any research on that explicitly, but I would like to know what you guys have found out.
Yeah, I will say, I think that thematic approach works beautifully in English language arts. In social studies, our current social studies research really tells us that students learn best through a chronological approach that unfolds stories for students. When you think about social studies, it's a lot of unfolding of stories through these primary source documents and accounts. And so social studies research currently points to this as the best way to really build knowledge from year to year over time.
Okay, thank you.
I have a question, Dr. Bromley. LDE was charged with the drafting of the social studies content standards. And what I need clarity on in trying to understand the inquiry-based process. As an educator trained in delivery of instruction, pedagogy with teaching methods, etc., in that area of being an effective teacher and best practices. So the question I have is, why is the inquiry-based approach attached to the content standards? Because if you were charged with developing the content standards, why is there an attachment to the inquiry-based approach?
Yeah, I mean, I think Dr. Chasson will speak to this as well, but we were looking at really trying to draw on primary source documents, historical documents, whether it's the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, Gettysburg Address, any number of primary source documents, and then as the base, have students understand what are the facts behind that primary source documents, but then also at the same time, ask questions about that. What was going on in society at that point? What prompted this? What was the result as a result of this primary source document being released? So it was really more about having students engage with documents after they understood the facts behind them, so they would have some level of engagement behind that. And Dr. Chasson may want to add to that.
Sure, I'll just add that inquiry is a nationally recognized best practice for teaching social studies. And like I've said a few times, our team provided the content work group members with all states' current social studies standards. And we see states do this in a variety of ways. It's really a design decision that is made by the state, by the work groups, by the educators designing and developing these standards from state to state. States do this in different ways. There are states who call them inquiry standards and have them sit next to their content standards, as we have in this current draft as we see. Other states call them different things. They call them instructional practices. They call them disciplinary concepts. In some states, we see actually build the inquiry design into the content standards. So it's really a design decision, but I'll say more often than not, inquiry is embedded in social studies as it is a nationally recognized best practice for teaching social studies and has been for many years, as I mentioned earlier with those 1987 documents that I quoted earlier.
So I guess what I'm trying to understand is since it's embedded, you're instructing the state of Louisiana educators to deliver this type of method. Am I understanding?
As a
this?
standard, it would be.
As a standard, I'm just struggling with that.
I think what is most important, and the question you're asking really has to go back to the primary source documents. I think that we have to do a better job as a state of giving access to the actual primary source document. First and foremost, before interpretations are made about that document, making sure that the child has that actual document in front of them.
Well, there should be some differentiation between this, what teachers should teach versus the inquiry process for UConn standards and how they should deliver.
And President, I'm sorry, I was also just going to add, the work group, the two work groups and the steering committee are advisory to BESE. And so along the way, if BESE so chooses to give particular guidance on a direction or content, that's something that we need to hear so that we can relate to the content team and the workbook team, such as Dr. Boke's comments and Mr. Mellon's about, you know.
That's why I'm bringing this
yeah.
forward,
And
absolutely.
so, you know,
We
the work group and the steering committee are simply advisory to BESE and are working hard, but they are advisory to BESE.
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, to somewhat follow up on the question you had about why a teaching method would be put in the content standards, since the teaching method is not a standard. Let me ask, I would imagine there are probably a lot of other really wonderful teaching methods that are highly recommended. Are there any of those also being proposed to be put into these standards?
So the inquiry, design, and process is what is recognized as best practice for social studies teaching and learning. I will say inquiry is an umbrella though. If we think earlier when I talked a little bit about the definition of inquiry and then what it looks like in classroom, inquiry is really, to Dr. Bromley's point, about engaging with your documents and sources in order to form a deep understanding. And so y'all saw earlier that table I went over with what you can expect of students, what you can expect of teachers in an inquiry-based classroom approach. And it's really a variety of instructional practices under that inquiry umbrella. But it's really about engagement with the sources rather than students just memorizing facts and reading documents. It's about how are they making connections between all of these things. How are they asking questions? Not just reading the document, but questioning who wrote this document? Why did they write it? How did their world around them inform what they wrote about and their viewpoint in this document? That is an inquiry-based approach.
Okay, well, to go back to the question, as I said, there must be several really good teaching methods that are recognized. Are there any other teaching methods that are being put into the standards or recommended to be put into the standards other than this one teaching method that you mentioned of inquiry-based?
No.
Okay, so just this one.
But as I said, it is not just a single method, it is really an umbrella.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Mr. Yes.
Yeah, let me just applaud the committee and the department as it relates to the inquiry-based approach. I've been teaching law school for 2 decades, and we generally refer to it, Representative James, as the Socratic method, which I'm sure is emblazoned in your brain as it is in mine from law school, because it's such an effective tool in terms of causing students to critically think about the subject matter. Just not simply learning facts, but it's I think, an important approach, not just at the higher ed level, but at the earliest ages possible. I understand from your comments, Dr. Chasson, that this is a national best practice, but I just want to echo from having done this a long time, that it is an extraordinarily effective method to have children engaged, students engaged in the conversation about why a fact exists, where it comes from, to really think through it and be a participant in the process as opposed to simply being a spectator. So I'll just say I'm a fan of that sort of approach to pedagogy and to teaching. So.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes.
Dr. Chason, there's a lot of conversation amongst this board and citizens of Louisiana, a lot of concern as well with regard to student performance in reading, math, and science. You don't hear a whole lot about student performance in social studies. I've seen some of those numbers. Those numbers aren't impressive. I'm curious, first of all, if you could sort of refresh the board on student performance in this area, and would have any consideration was given to that student performance during this review, and how this review might impact that student performance?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Mr. Morris, and the reason is, we talk a lot about proficiency rates or mastery in English and math, and we know where they are, and they're nowhere near where they need to be. But whenever we talk about, reading and math, we're talking about in the 40s. And whenever we look at our social studies proficiency rates or mastery rates, it's like 24, 25. So it is the lowest level in terms of proficiency that we have across the 4 content areas. And so I appreciate you bringing that point forward, because my team will tell you it's something I talk about all the time. And I think it has to do with a couple of things. Number one, as pointed out, our standards lack multiple historical perspectives. Our standards lack rigor. Our standards aren't sequenced in order that makes sense in terms of a story over time. And that's just from the standards standpoint. Then you have to have curriculum that actually aligns to it. So we don't have that. And then, so because we don't have those 2 things, then we can't appropriately develop staff to be able to teach these things. And so this is just a step in a process that has to happen, which ultimately leads, and the whole reason we're doing any of this is for better outcomes for our kids. And social studies is the lowest outcome level that we have across 4 content areas.
Thanks, sir.
Yes, Ms. Bochin?
As Mr. Castile said, we teach the inquiry-based method in every area of our curriculum, not just being proposed in the social studies standards. We're doing it in science curriculum, we've moved over to it in the ELA curriculum. We've taught the Socratic method for years, as Mr. Castile has mentioned. I know you've done a lot of law school. We moved that down in our K-12 environment as well. And I think when you look at the standards, you're not going to see standards that say, tell me what year this happened, or identify the modes of transportation in a certain era. What you're going to see is take the data from the documents, analyze it, compare and contrast it, or including inferences, which is what we try to get kids to do in everyday life. Our current social studies standards, and as Dr. Bromley just mentioned, when we do the assessments, our kids score lowest on them because we have absolutely no tier 1 curriculum that go along with those particular standards. If you talk to any teacher in a state, they're continually drawing materials that they hope would address these current standards. So this is the first step in making sure that it's plain what we're asking children to do. We're doing it through an inquiry-based method, but you can put many different labels on that particular term. It's really getting kids to take the facts, take what happened, look at those source documents like the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, all of these different source documents, and begin to draw conclusions with them. And explain and analyze in detail. And I think that, if you really look through the standards themselves, I think you're going to see that they are general in nature. When we get to developing or looking for curriculum sources that will meet the standards, that's going to be local decisions as to what curriculum is going to be in the schools in order to address these standards. And then, of course, we have to make sure that the assessment piece that goes along with this is going to reflect those standards, and the curriculum that we choose to address the standards will help our students do better on these assessments. So that's a 3-pronged process here. And we're right here at the very beginning in redoing it. We went through the same situation we did the science studies, and we overhauled those. There were gaps in what we were teaching when we had things up. We went through the same when we did the ELA and the math standards, how we were going to approach them with our students, training our teachers, getting the curriculum in place that we needed. So I think this is an important first step. We have to remember it is the first step. When we look at these timelines, we're not even going to implement the actual assessments on these things. I think we had the 23-24 school year essentially.
Thank you, Ms. Bochin. good conversation. Actually, coming back to what I asked is just to clarify why the inquiry was attached to the standards, that we've never, or I shouldn't say never, haven't done that prior to with other standards. Is there, and look, I've been trained in inquiry based. I've done this approach. Nothing against it, love it, we enjoy as peers delivering that. But I just have a question about whether this particular inquiry standard you have can be an attachment, like a guide to the social studies standards, and you're recommending this teaching method. Because there are many other teaching methods that occur in delivery of instruction. So it's just under consideration. Thank you.
I do
Board
think,
members?
Holly, it's important to note that the inquiry-based approach is also about the student's skill. So it is an instructional method, but it is about the skills that the students are learning alongside the content as well.
Thank you. Mr. Morris? Yes, I'm sorry, Representative Ryan?
Thank you. I just have a question, maybe you can elaborate if there's any information on it, but I think a lot of people who get involved in policy committee want to fix a problem. What do other states do, right? And I think you mentioned there were other state standards that were shared. I know we talked about some third-party groups that were, from a forum, whoever. Can you just elaborate on how much the committee has looked at other states and sort of said, look, they're doing it well, maybe we should incorporate that?
Yeah, I sure can. So the content work groups did look, we offered all 50 states. So we have a document with links to every single state. So current social studies standards for them to take a look at. They were able to look, and you'll see our current draft standards really reflect some choices from different pieces of different states all around the country. All different states everywhere, and so some they like the way this state formatted, some they like some of the language of this state, and so they were able to pick and choose what they thought made the most sense here for us in Louisiana. I know that they did use that C3 framework. As I stated earlier, that C3 framework is not a new document. It was published back in 2014 by the National Council of Social Studies. And so if you talk to social studies teachers today, you'll find that quite a lot of them have seen that C3 framework and are actually utilizing some of the knowledge and resource from that framework already in their classrooms, because the C3 framework is recognized as representing national best practices in teaching social studies.
Mr. Garvey?
Yes, Ms. Bocek mentioned that the inquiry-based method is used in other subjects, several other subjects. And it's been used, I think she said, well, for a long time. We just recently redid our science standards, and I would assume we're using inquiry-based methods in the science class. And we just redid our ELA. I think it was mentioned that that's another class where this method is used. Did we put the inquiry-based methods into the standards for those two subjects when we recently redid those standards?
So those are embedded, the inquiry approach is really embedded within the standards.
It's mentioned directly in the standards? Or is it embedded in an indirect way?
They're embedded within. They're not necessarily called out in a separate set of standards the way this draft document has. The design approach is a little different. In science, I know I talked earlier about how some states for social studies are calling it disciplinary concepts. So in science, you see we have like cross-cutting concepts. That's what we call them here for science.
And if it was embedded in the other ones, why aren't we embedding it in social studies instead of doing it this different way?
It was a design decision of the content work group. Like I've said, they were able to look across at different states, and different states do it differently. And so the content work group made that design decision to call them out separately.
So if it was decided that we ought to just embed the inquiry-based method in social studies as we did in science, we already have a kind of a template on how to do that, I guess, because we just did the science standards.
So if you all remember, inquiry was one of the guiding principles that BESE approved back in December. And then at the March steering committee meeting, the March steering committee did approve, there was a vote where they approved an inquiry-based approach. The content work group then made the design decision to call them out as separate standards because that is how some other states have chosen to design their standards.
But could we go back and decide to just embed the inquiry-based method in the social studies standards instead of listing it separately directly?
So once again, like Dr. Bromley stated a little while ago, the content work group and the steering committee are really, meant to serve and advise BESE, but ultimately the decision is up to BESE.
And if we decided that, you feel confident that you could carry that out?
Well, it would be, it is the educators on the content work group who actually would change that design. And we have a wealth of experience, knowledge, and education. They're a really impressive group of individuals on that content work group.
Ms. Jones.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Dr. Kizon, for such an informative, comprehensive presentation. Following up a bit on this inquiry pathway, but more specifically on the construction of the committee and how, in fact, that connects to previous protocols or processes for how standards were developed. I think there's a set of assumptions around the level of expertise that go into the kind of design choices, like the design choice we happen to be discussing now. Can you speak to previous experiences with the development of standards and the role that experts have played or committees have played in making those kinds of design choices?
Sure, absolutely. So the process that we followed for this committee application process was really similar to what was used for ELA, for math, for science over the last decade. The whole approach to the application process and the scoring was really very, very similar to what we've used in the past for previous standards review processes.
Thank you. Dr. Davis?
And so I guess I'm a little confused about, the point of the questions regarding inquiry-based language. Because what I heard from Mr. Garvey is that we can still have inquiry-based standards as long as we go back and hide inquiry inside the language of the standards the way we did in the past, but what we don't want is to have the inquiry-based pulled out. So we can still have inquiry-based standards, we just don't want to call them that. We want them the same thing inside the standards in the same way we've done with science and math. And so I guess my question is, but that doesn't change anything, right? I guess I don't understand what the problem is with the layout now, other than it looks different than the way we have done our standards in the past. Like, so can somebody explain to me what the real issue is?
Yeah, since you're asking about my questions, I would like to try to explain. And going back to staff, would you say that you said, or that it's true that the inquiry-based method is hidden in the science standards?
No.
I don't think anybody implied that they were hidden. My purpose for asking about it is to find out what different options we have to address this method. And the method, or the situation, I think, draws a question mark to itself when you have a method being put into a set of standards, and the method is not a standard. So it draws question marks. And when there are questions out there, I think extra information about how to address the situation is a good thing to have and to share. And that's why I was asking about this.
Okay. But it is like, so inquiry-based learning is already in existing standards that we have. The only difference this time is that the committee that was approved by us, and we approved inquiry as one of the things that we wanted them to look at, made a design choice to pull it out. I'm sorry for using the word hidden, rather than embedding it inside the standards. Like, that's the big difference.
Right, Dr. Davis, I would say that in other content, and as Mr. Garvey mentioned, it is an embedded principle in those standards. We signaled to the work group that having students engage with documents, inquiries, credit method, whatever you call it, was something for consideration. That group then made a design decision around the standards to not embed that in, but to call that out separately as standards. So I think that to answer Mr. Garvey's question is, yes, they can be embedded, but as a design decision, the team of experts tasked to do this job decided to call them out separately.
Ms. Bocher.
Okay, I'm looking at the document we have in front of us. The first 3 or 4 pages outlines the inquiry methods. If you look at the first page, inquiry standards, it says developing compelling questions and supporting questions. The second one is gathering and evaluating sources. Then you go to the third page, it's developing claims and using evidence. The fourth is communicating and critiquing conclusions. And the fifth is taking information action, taking informed action. So I think what they're saying here is use these 5 strategies that we're putting here you can use these 5 strategies, which are inquiry-based, to address the standards. So for example, if I look at the first kindergarten, or one of the first kindergarten's standards, it says describe how communities can change over time, or explain the importance of equality and diversity in building strong communities, or compare different accounts of the same historical event. So I think these inquiry standards are giving teachers sort of a roadmap of how can you do this with kids. And they're very general in nature. Develop questions and supporting questions. We could take these off if, that would be the general consensus, and keep the standards, and these could be, if BESE so choose, a methodology to address or help teachers understand how to address some of the standards, as well as other ways to do so as well. That would make more sense. Now, I'm not on the standards committee, I don't know what that would do, but when I'm looking at the standards themselves, these first 5 pages on here, inquiry standards, are just some methodologies to use to get teachers to the point of addressing these content standards. If that would help, Jim, if that would help in your thought process on how to do this, I think we could make that happen.
Good thought, thank you. Anyone else? We can go into public comment and we can come back again with questions.
I do have one more question.
Sure. President.
So because I think the beginning of your presentation, Dr. Chason really spoke to the distinction between the role of BESE in setting standards, the role of local leaders in then choosing appropriate curriculum. I am curious what the role of the legislature is or has been related to this. We have the benefit of legislative colleagues who've obviously taken an interest in this conversation. And I'm curious if this might be better, addressed to Dr. Leger, maybe Dr. Brumley, but if you can just speak to this past session, what role did the legislature play? What bills came up that were relevant to this topic? Just so we have a more global view, I'm sure I would benefit from that, possibly other board members, certainly the public, how that actually ties into the conversation we're having today. I think that might be more appropriate for Dr. Leger.
We had, over the course of the last legislative session, a number of bills that, and/or resolutions that dealt with essentially social studies education. I think both Dr. Leger and Mr. Moss are both here if they want to talk through any of those particular bills.
Leger, Department Ed. Ms. Jones, I'm sorry. Can you repeat your question, please?
I was thinking about the comprehensive information about what those bills were, how they fared, and how that in any way impacts the decision, the conversation we're having today as a board and a policy-making board responsible for the standards.
Yeah. And a couple of bills that come right to mind were some bills that were filed that sought to include certain standards or certain concepts in the process. And those two in particular that come to mind were filed by Rep. Hodges. And neither of those bills were able to successfully navigate through the process.
Were those the only two bills?
That come to mind for this past session. And Ethan Moss is here, and if he wants to, if he has anything. But those were the two that immediately come to mind. I don't have that in front of me.
Okay, so at this point, there have been no bills passed in the legislature that are informing in any way the direction of what we then do as a board.
And I don't have that right in front of me, but certainly, follow up with you. We can look at that and get that back to BESE.
We're not aware of, we know that bills were filed, but as Dr. Leger said, we don't believe any made it through the process that would impact what we're doing here today. I do think, it's not your question directly, but I do think it matters. Like, we have to have a higher quality set of standards for our kids, and I think, the choice to engage with legislators informally, but also formally here today is going to be an important part of the process over the next few months, because as they step into session next spring, they're going to need to be armed, or they will have an advantage from being armed with the process that we have worked through over the last year. And so that's why I'm really appreciative of the various legislators that are here today. And between Dr. Leger and Mr. Malonzo, we will continue to engage the legislative delegation around what we're doing, and certainly take their feedback along the way.
I just wanted clarity on what everybody's goals were.
I might be able to help provide a little content there. I think a couple of things. There were a few bills that made it to the House floor, and that was about it, related to the Holocaust or certain primary ideas and documents. I think actually that helped educate legislators, certainly me, sort of serving as the acting chair over the last month, understand this process. I don't think I would be here, honestly, if we hadn't kind of gone through that. And I mean, Dr. Brumley's, Lieutenant Brumley, was really good about it, because, I think people were looking at me for a period of time to sort of help. I mean, we don't have a lot of experience in education on the House side. And I mean experience, like, we don't have a lot of experience engaging BESE, LDOE, and so it was very helpful to kind of see that. And I think you have a number of legislators here, Senator Talbot, Representative James, Representative Owen, and I know there's a number that are more willing to engage here and find a way to sort of, certainly look, there's people in this state that certainly have concerns about certain things that have been proposed, or they believe have been proposed, there's no doubt about it. But I think we also want to respect this process. And your role, BESE, as a state authorized committee to make decisions as well. So none of that's helpful.
I did want to also add, Ms. Orange-Jones, that there is some older legislation that did pass that's really been in place for years. I'm not sure exactly how many years, but there were some pieces of legislation around some basic civics and foundational principles that are already in legislation that our team did make sure to look at and make sure were included in the current draft standards, but nothing from this past session.
And also, Ms. Orange-Jones, one of the things that was important to us last session is important to us moving forward is, while we certainly understand and respect and need the work of the legislators, we have taken the position that, content we feel like content is important for those decisions to be made here with teachers as much as possible. And so that was, one of the decisions that we had, made, and we had these conversations with legislators around specific content. And that, again, is why this process is really important, that we get this right.
At this time, we'll have public comments. We have 2 green cards, and at the table, Jenna, for Dr. Chesson. Good, thank you. We're going to get these public comments. And Representative Charles Owens. Please come forward to the table. Jennifer Kerrigan.
It's okay, ma'am?
Yes, sir. You need one of yours.
Thank you all very much.
Ms. Jennifer is coming forward. You can sit. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Please identify yourself and who you're representing.
Thank you very much. My name is Charles Owen. I'm House Representative District 30. I live in Vernon Parish, represent Vernon and Beauregard parishes. I kind of feel like a guy who has come prepared for the wrong test. When we did this in July across the way and had public comments about the content standards, I came down and I got the document the night before, and I read through it. I spoke broadly about it, and since then I have been drilling down on it. I have been drilling down. Now, ma'am, reference to your question earlier, I am a member of House Education, and I pay very, very careful attention. It's one of the things that I ran on, is that I was going to pay attention to try to build relationships and to try to make things better for our whole state. I happen to represent a very good school system. Vernon and Beauregard are always very, very good schools. So I pay attention for them. I happen to be married to a teacher. My dad was a superintendent of schools, so that's kind of what my background is. But since the last meeting, I have been drilling down on those content standards, down to the letter, to the comma, and to the prepositions that end some sentences. And I have an exhaustive response but my own review that I will be submitting when public review comes up in the month of October. And I will be sharing those with my members of House Education and Senate Education, just so we all kind of know what's coming, so we can inform our constituents. And I think that's what one of our jobs is, for our constituents to know what's going on and for us to try to facilitate that type of communication. I will tell y'all, I just found these new standards this morning. Dr. Chasson told me about them. I will take those. I will do the same thing over the next month, and I'll have that ready to go when October rolls around. In regards to the ones that were reviewed in July, I think what we're dealing with now is kind of an improvement of those and a change of those. So I will tell y'all briefly what my thoughts are on it, if anyone's interested, which is why I came down today. As far as positives go, I will tell you, as I read through those content standards, I was very pleased to see the inclusion. I guess it was the inclusion, because I really don't know the old ones. But I would say the emphasis on the experience of minorities and underrepresented populations in our country. This shows up throughout the document. And that was a big emphasis in the House 2 years ago. My colleague, Representative Duplessis, was curious about that. He was asking for a study on it. We delayed the study so we could get a review of this project here. I was pleased to see all of that. It is throughout grade level. It is throughout the document. We speak extensively about that in the content standards, and I think it's important. And I'll tell you why I think it's important, because I think we've done a bad job as a country over time of not including those things. Anytime I get a chance, I'm in public, I tell people about the terrible thing that Woodrow Wilson did, the President of the United States, of erasing the contributions of black people from history books. He did that 100 years ago as President of the United States, and our country has struggled with those kind of things ever since. And so we need to undo those. The histories of all people need to be included as we go through these things. And so I was very pleased to see that. I hope Royce Duplessis is happy with it as well. Something else I'm pleased with, I think the big rocks in our country are covered in these content standards. The big important things that that our kids need to know are covered, and that's what I saw initially. I will tell you, I'm very happy and thankful with the openness that I've gotten from DOE and BESE and the questions that I have relayed. I asked the questions about how the committee was put together as soon as the meeting was over, and I got a very detailed response. I'm not sure I agree with the process, but I will tell you I am grateful for the openness and the rapid response from Dr. Brumley's team, and from any time I ask a question. I tell you as a legislator, I'm grateful for that. My concerns with the content standards are much more exhaustive. As I read through this, and I tell you, I read every word, all 39 pages of it, about 4 times. I took it down as far as I could. It seems to me like it's more of a sociology or an anthropology type of content standards than it is social studies. One thing I did was I did word searches in there. And I found out in 39 pages the word liberty appears 3 times. Culture and cultural appears 75 times. Freedom appears 6 times. And there's examples like that I can give you all the way around. And I think that the standards as they stand today, and I have not seen these, as they stood yesterday, shall I say, are a little out of balance. I think we cover a lot of important things, but I think it needs to be balanced with a more objective approach to what really happened in history. I think a lot of things are assumed away. I think that there's some incendiary language in there that we need to talk about, or that you guys need to talk about as you make these decisions. For example, the phrase American imperialism appears in there as fact. A lot of people don't believe the United States is an imperialist nation. I don't. The phrase in there, the Constitution is a living document, it shows up in there. A lot of people don't believe that. Some people do. And some of these things that are debatable points, it should be, to me, as we are creating these standards, it would make sense that they should be listed as debatable points, not as facts. So those are the kind of concerns I have. This is the type of thing that I have drilled down on. And my intent here, my honest intent here, is to make sure that I inform my own citizens as to what's going on. That I keep my colleagues in the House and the Senate informed as to my work, because we're all doing lots of things. We all know our state and our world is a busy, busy place. So I've kind of taken this on as my cause and as my effort. And I will stand ready to facilitate in any of this, in any way that we can. Because I think we as a country, and I said this last time, we have got to come together. We've got a chance here with this on the table for us to come together and to bring these disparate views and these deficiencies we've had, pull it together and to do it correctly without having an acid bath and without destroying each other. So that's my goal. That's why I'm here. I want to thank y'all again for having this open meeting. I will be here with you guys this afternoon and again on Wednesday. So if I can answer any questions to you guys, I will be more than happy to. I'll make myself available all the time.
Thank you, Representative Owens. Does anyone have a question for Owens? Or do you have a question? You're good. Thank you. Appreciate it so much for your partnership and joint effort with us. Next, Jennifer, please identify yourself and your agency.
I can't just speak off the cuff like he can. So, I'm Jennifer Kerrigan. I'm the head of Louisiana Save Our Schools, which actually formed out of interest in these social studies standards. I'm from Covington, Louisiana, and I first want to thank you because the work that has been done since the June 26th meeting is extraordinary. The response clearly to the public input is just affirming to see that clearly the voices of the public were heard and responded to, and it says a lot. It says a lot about our state superintendent and the efforts that he made, and I really appreciate it. It does leave me with a question, because I don't see in the review of the process any meetings, and since that date. And I think that that's one of the things that I would ask you to consider as you consider your process. Ms. Jones asked a really good question about the legislative process and how that might have impacted things. And so I thought, well, I wrote down my remarks, but maybe let me start there. I think that there is a good answer to maybe what has driven the public interest in this. There's a national interest in this topic. There's a broad and just deep interest in our schools today across the whole country. Some of it's good, and some of it maybe is being driven by division. It's not all good. There certainly is a narrative. There's no question. But we need to make sure that every piece of our process is as transparent as possible. And that means even the good stuff, right? Even when we're driving towards really great change by maybe our content work groups, anything we're doing, I would just ask you, as much as possible, make that process transparent. Show the public what we're doing, what you're doing to make change so that they can see you're responsive to their concerns. Because I think it helps, right? It shows them that you're working towards a solution. I also really want to encourage you to consider a couple of things, and I know I'm just one person, but I'm just going to throw these out there. I think that, again, from the presentation, maybe there's something left unanswered, and that's this organization, Educating for American Democracy. You know, they were part of every meeting of the steering committee. They spoke. Somebody from the organization. They were really lauded in the notes, and they've just kind of disappeared, but nothing formal has been said about what their position is. There's been no notice that they're gone. They're just not being mentioned. So I would love to know where they've gone. Are they gone? Because there's a lot of good critique of who they are. Somebody mentioned that they were bipartisan. Of over 300 participants in the organization, about 10 of them are credentialed, according to one study, as centrists and conservatives. Doesn't sound very bipartisan to me. I did try to email, in a group email, to all of you a critique we did at Louisiana Save Our Schools of EAD and their roadmap and several of their documents, but your system bounced that back every time I try to send it to you. I don't think it likes me. Maybe I'll try to send it to you individually. Also, I guess that segues really cleanly into another organization I heard mentioned here today, and that's the Fordham Institute. I would just urge you to do a little research on the Fordham Institute. They like to also present themselves as conservative or bipartisan. You know, the Fordham Institute was one of the major organizations behind the push for Common Core. I think the state has a strong reaction to Common Core. So I would urge that any organization that we're relying on to rate our curriculum, we might want to take a second look at it for its relationship to Common Core. Which also would bring me to another segue, C3. So I brought my phone up not because I needed it. Well, not because I wanted it, but because I needed it. C3. It's a real thing. Very important. National Council for the Social Studies from their website. The C3 Framework Organization. It's a really powerful document that they put together where they describe what the inquiry standard is, and it's a really powerful tool for studying certain subjects, science among them. I would really support that, because science is a different subject than social studies, right? Inquiry is extremely important to the study of science. But social studies is different.
Can you wrap up your comment, ma'am?
I absolutely will.
Thank you.
Dimension 4, Because developing questions and planning inquiries, Dimension 2, civics, economics, geography, and history. Dimension 3, gathering and evaluating sources, developing claims, and using evidence. Dimension 4, communicating and critiquing conclusions, and finally, taking informed action. In some circles, we call that action civics.
Thank you, Ms. Kieran.
So I would just encourage you to consider that.
Thank you. Possibly to answer a question here, Dr. Bromley, America for Democracy, can you share how this agency became involved?
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the, as Kieran had mentioned, it is one of the resources that was provided to both the work group and the steering committee, along with the C3, along with the advanced placement guides, along with standards from all of the other states across the country. You know, they don't even have a curriculum or set of standards. They provide a roadmap, much like you'll see in C3. And so has there been influence from the various resources that we provided? I would assume absolutely so. But we at no point said that any particular resource was the end-all be-all for the conversation.
Thank you. We have one more green card, but this is your Orange Jones.
I just wanted to, Representative James, if you're able to speak to the same question, I should have called you up before, but I'm very curious, like, just from a legislative perspective, it came up in the last comments as well, what the role of the legislature was this last session. I think the thing that hasn't been addressed, Dr. Leger, perhaps was, correct me if I'm wrong, just graveyard follows bill. Where does that fit into this conversation? Just curious.
Mr. James, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ms. Jones. I was trying to just sit back and listen today. I think that, Representative Wright, he said something that I firmly agree with. I would certainly not be here, but for all of the conversations that took place in the legislature. I, for one, think that it is not our place to tell you how to do your job. I heard the young lady that presented talk about the number of educators and thought leaders and experts that took part in this process. I tend to believe that our kids, I have a 4-year-old, I tend to believe that those decisions about what and how she learns should be made by experts and go throughout a process that I heard about today, and not be bogged down in some of what is happening across the street. And I do concede that the national conversations, of course, have driven a lot of those conversations. Too often, we, and most of you are elected, I know some are appointed, but we go through a process of campaigning, and then there's a time to go. I think that too often across the street, we're still in the campaign mode, and what I heard today about the process is actual governing experts take the time, they put in the work, and then they produce a document for us to digest and vote on. And Representative Owens, what he has done today, I think, is our role. He's read through the steps. I have as well, right? He's made his comments. That's our part, right? Because I came here really as a parent to really listen. As, like I said, I have a 4-year-old. But I think that our role should be what Representative Owens has done as a member of education. And I would hope that you all, not be driven by a lot of the national and public conversation and the discourse that's happening across the street. The positive thing is that we are now paying, I think, Mark and I agree that we're paying extra attention, not trying to influence, but I just want to be educated when I get calls about these things, and I remind them, hey, you need to call Mr. Castile because that's more of his shop. Don't call my office. That's for Mr. Castile and Dr. Davis for those of us that are in that room. So I think that way too often we have tried to, push bills to regarding curriculum, and I think that that's not our place. I think that the body that you all serve on is the place for these conversations, and I want to, encourage my colleagues to take more of an aim that Representative Owens had in being, more just actively engage in the process. Now, I too, since the conversation started, I think that, it is commendable that a lot of the achievements have been included American Americans, but I think that it's short-sighted to just highlight the achievements and not the pain and the struggle and the inequities in many of those that still exist today, right? I think that, we have to fully address history, and I think that some of these things, while uncomfortable, are necessary conversations.
Thank you, Brian. Very, very well said. Thank you, Representative James. We have one more green board. Patrick Dobard. Please come down. Good morning.
Good afternoon. We just had a click to the hour.
Okay. Sorry.
Good afternoon, Chair. Good afternoon. Patrick Billboard, Representative Luce from New Orleans. First, I want to thank you all. I've been here just months ago when we were having this conversation and establishing this. So I want to thank our representative of New Orleans, Kieran Jones, and the superintendent. And just a few thoughts as I heard some of the people speak today, and they've also talked to different constituents and stakeholders. But before I do that, Representative Bryce Duplessis, we just were communicating, and he really wanted to be here today, but he had a family matter that he needs to take care of. And he specifically wanted to thank Representative Owens for continuing to try, as well as his fellow committee members and representatives, and wanted to make certain that that was known. He's still committed to the process and will continue to work with us in every way possible. A couple of things. One, I sat here before and talked about, as a former social studies teacher, career educator all in Louisiana. The social studies has always been really complex. And I just did a quick glance and saw where 6th grade Louisiana students from the past assessments in social studies, just 6th grade, if my calculation is correct, and I just did a quick scan of it, the percent of students that's at mastery for 6th grade social studies in the state, that's mastery and above, so mastery and advanced, our two highest, I believe it's about 21%. That means that only 21% of our students statewide are ready for next grade level college and career right now. No way in the midst of a pandemic. So I'm willing to bet that if we go back to 2019, that number's not much higher. And so it makes me think, when we look at this and see grade 6, 1600 to 1791 AD, what do we really want our kids to have learned or to be able to do as they progress through their schooling experiences? And so I would challenge you to not make this about trivial pursuit, about word usage, semantics. Because as a former social studies teacher, if you tell me I've got a certain error, I'm going to cover everything I can, use my own supplemental materials, I'm going to do inquiry-based, I'm going to do all kinds of things to just really spark interest. Because if a kid's not interested and they're checked out, they'll ask, first of all, back in the day, was social studies allow me to go to the next grade or not? And we focused on what? You have to be LA. And that's why social studies always just kind of got left behind. And kids didn't really take it seriously. It's just always just this area where it's just that. And now I'm so glad for all of the focus and the attention on social studies. But I really wish we'd start looking at the quality of the content and what we're expecting our students to learn. Because when the state average is at approaching basic for social studies, we all should be ashamed of ourselves. And we all should be focusing on what can we do for our kids that they will understand content, be able to take a primary source document, explain what they just read, and make it applicable to other things that they'll learn. That should be the goal, at least one of the goals. So I hope that as this committee continues to shape itself, continues to decide what will be taught at what grade level, that we don't lose focus on what's the most important thing, which is ensuring that our students have a balanced educational experience in one where they are actually ready for college and career. So I hope we get away from the rhetoric. I hope we get away from all the pontifications. I hope we get away from the pseudo-experts that want to chime in on something that's super complex, it's super difficult, and we already know that there are inequities that have allowed us to be in a place where our students are struggling so mightily. Oh, and by the way, we are in the midst of a pandemic. And so there is an extra layer of stress and unprecedented amount of unfortunate incidents that none of us can control right now. We can do our part, but we can't really control how much our kids are able to focus and how much they're able to stay in tune to their work. And so I would just encourage you all to keep those things in mind, make sure that the committee stays tight. And then the last thing I would say is that I appreciate some folks pointing out, I believe Representative Owens did, everybody's got a role. So the legislature has a role, and I'm glad that they're respecting the role of BESE. And BESE has a role, and at the outset of Dr. Chassault's presentation, she mentioned that the locals will determine curriculum. And I appreciate that. BESE giving the locals the direction, and then the locals decide, they use their curriculum, and we always believe that those closest to the children should be making those decisions. And then the locals, as they decide which curriculum, how they want to implement, they'll make certain that they're following the guidance that the state has given. Everybody's got a role. So thank y'all for what you're doing, what you're going to continue to do. We'll continue to watch this closely, and we'll look forward to just see some progress over the next several months and the next several years. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Chair. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Gilbert. Thank you for your comments. Just because I understand you're here formally in your current CEO capacity, but you do have some institutional knowledge of the department, of course, given your previous roles. I'm just curious. I've been stuck on governance all morning because I want to clarify roles and what the historic perspective on that has been. There has been some, well-informed information that certainly made it to me, possibly others, that there are committee members, for example, that have been bullied, right, have been canceled in some way, have been sort of called out on media because they decided to sort of give up their time in this way. And I'm just curious, and that is very upsetting, frankly, for any body that comes together to do a public service such as this committee has done, which has been, I think, as Dr. Chassault has said, comprised of experts and subject matter specialists who are closest to the work. Can you just speak to the historic role that committees have played in other processes for the department? I mean, is that something that has existed in the past? Is this new? Have you found that trusting committees tends to,
It's funny you mentioned that, because I'm getting old. And what I realized was that back when we were doing standard settings, when I was working at the department in the role of social studies assessment coordinator, there was nothing like this. It was almost so under the radar. I think I see you, Dr. Gosha, shaking your head. This is to me, this is a symptom of where we are in 2021, really with social media, to be quite honest. Because we would have to beg people to try to serve our committees. And I can remember there's a lady from Tangipahoa, oh, good Lord, I see her face, but I can't remember her name, who was our social studies guru. I believe she's from the area where Governor Evans is from. I believe her name was Amy, I can't remember her last name. But she was one where I can always remember we had 8 social studies content persons. I would convene the groups on the assessment side, and then my colleague Susanna Craig, I believe, was doing the social studies side. And we would just meet, we would put out for the public process. Never anything like this. I think it got more involved from a public perspective was when the Common Core and those debates started occurring. And then now this is just it's, on the one hand, I love as a social studies person, I love the attention. But then on the other hand, it's a bit frightening because there's just a lot people don't understand and know, and no one should ever be bullied. No one should ever be made to feel less than or treated in a way that I'm hearing that individuals are serving on these committees. Because all they're trying to do is follow what the standards are asking them to do. Trying to put, the sequencing, good God, y'all took me back, almost 20 years. Because it's so hard. What to teach at, whatever, how deep you want to go. I want to talk more about cuneiform really deeply, but how can you do that with a third grader? Dr. Gofi, it's like you're not going to get the substantive nature that you would like to get if you're 12 or even 22 years old. And so, never seen anything like this. And if people want to use their voice and their platforms for good, and ultimately, again, where I sit professionally and personally, to improve the overall quality of education kids are getting, then let's do that. But if we're going to spend time debating over what we might call the error, or what we may determine how deep you want to go in one area or another, kids are having trouble just reading a paragraph and telling you what they read. And I wish that more folks would focus on that and give space to that, but I have not seen anything like this in the social studies world. Y'all have not for real.
Thank you,
Thank you. Anyone on the board have any more questions? We do not have any more public comments. Anyone else? Dr. Brown? We have no more questions. We do want to say how much we appreciate the department. The work you have done has been tremendous. It's hard work. People do not see the hard work you do. And this is not just an 8 to 3 job. This is 24/7 weekend that you're passionate to do and get done. And can't thank you enough to travel this journey that we have charged you to do. And we know at the end, there will be great results. So thank you. Any other board member? If not, this concludes this part of the part. Any objection to this? Any objection to the motion? Or before Mark, right? And Kirk, Senator Kirk, any comments? I'm so sorry, I wanted to let you have the last one.
Thank you. You know, it is hard to define what our role is. I mean, you know, you have things like Common Core come up and all those things, and you know, we look to y'all for guidance. So I'm sure that the feeling's mutual. I've only been on the Education Committee for 2 years now, so this is kind of new to me. Although all my in-laws are all public school teachers and administration and that kind of role, so we're glad to be here. I plan on being very engaged and engaged the last couple of years. I'm glad that Superintendent Brumley is here. We have a great dialogue. We all want the same thing, right? We want the quality education for our children. And, you know, if there's anything we can ever do, any ideas y'all have, any comments, criticisms, you know how to reach me. We'll take them all. Thank you.
Representative Wright?
Thanks. I mean, I know I made a few comments earlier on. I'll just kind of clarify a little bit here. First off, thanks for inviting me and Senator Talbot. I think this is a huge step for us. As I mentioned, you know, this last session in particular, but even going back to the first term, the first session of this term, you know, we're members of the committee, you know, we rely on members of the House or the Senate to take the time to get to understand things and take leadership, right? And so doing this is super important, whether it's myself, whether it's Senator Talbot, Representative Owen, Senator James, whoever's here. And so we're not always going to agree on the best way to go forward. The legislature can act, let's face it, but sometimes we don't. Maybe we should respect and just work with the agency that needs to do it. But at the end of the day, everybody's going to have different opinions on that, right? And I think it's very helpful to have someone like my friend Chuck Owen, you know, kind of diving in, understanding it, and being more with everybody else. So this is a good first step, obviously. I appreciate Superintendent Brumley sort of pushing this back because I do think there was a lot of public interest. Some of it good, some of it maybe not so good, I don't know. But we need to sort through that and make sure, in my mind, the most important thing is that the public can embrace this as much as possible and move forward so we can stop being at that basic level, right? If we, you know, half the population disagrees with what we're going forward, whether it's right or wrong in somebody's mind, you already have a problem, right? We need to figure out a way to get on the same page and embrace this and move forward to the most important part. So thanks for including that.
Thank you, appreciate it. And I charge board members to reach out to our friends in the legislature. Thank you, Representative Owens, Representative James, Representative Wright, and Senator Talbot. And let's not forget Representative Duplantis, who was supposed to be here. And of course, we do want to thank Senator Leo Fields and with his Senate Ed, along with House Speaker Clay Shanks-Snyder, who was aware of this, and Senator Page Cortez as President of the Senate.
Thank you, board members, and objection to the motion. None, seeing none, motion carried, and this will conclude this time. Recess for lunch. So thank you.
What time will we be back? 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock.